Welcome to the ACT podcast. Now, today we're going to be thinking about the origins of life and the universe, and questions about these kinds of things in schools often raise both controversy and curiosity in the classroom. So we're going to be thinking about how these topics are taught, what the law says about discussing things like creation and intelligent design, and how Christian teachers can navigate these questions wisely. And I'm here with Matthew Pickhaver from the Biblical Creation Trust, and he's going to chat with us about all things creation and biblical creation. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Lizzie. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm a great admirer of what you're doing at ACT.
Oh, thank you. That's really encouraging. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Biblical Creation Trust to begin with?
Sure, yeah. So I became a Christian when I was a boy, and my interest in the natural world, in God's creation, led me eventually to doing a zoology degree at University College London. And then when you've studied wild animals, what do you do? Well, I then went into primary teaching. So I did a
What's
primary...
he saying about primary school children?
I jest, of course. But yeah, I did a primary PGCE at University of East Anglia. And then I taught in a state primary school for 12 years. I enjoyed that very much. Obviously teaching science, but alongside, as primary teachers do, all the other subjects too. And I then spent some years actually in supported evangelism for some local churches. And for over 10 years now, nearly 12 actually, I've been working with Biblical Creation Trust. So we're a small UK-based gospel ministry that's focused on the origins question. We're really sort of helping the church, helping Christians to navigate the challenges that issue raises, both theologically and scientifically. So we like to show how the doctrine of creation relates to the rest of the scriptures, including its implications for the gospel, which is, we think, quite a neglected area. And we also love science. I mean, science is a form of worship, really. The psalmist says, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." And so we want to promote the very best of creation research. And of course, what we think about origins as well speaks into so many contemporary issues and challenges like marriage and gender and image and identity and bioethics and so on. And the worth of young people, as well, is very relevant here, our worth and value. So, and we're currently actually in the process of seeking to set up a creation research community, if you like, in Cambridge, which is something exciting that's just beginning, really. Yeah, so that's BCT.
That's fantastic. Now, I must just say, I heard that you studied at UCL. There's that wonderful museum, isn't there? That I go to sometimes when I've got a little bit of time.
Yeah.
The Grant Museum of Zoology.
Grant Museum of Zoology, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's the most bizarre place. And you can see the most incredible specimens, including that big jar of moles. It is so strange. I must say, if you've got a few moments free when you're in sort of central London, not far from Euston Station, I would definitely advise going to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's funny you say that, because actually when I was going for my interviews at various universities, mostly London ones, it was one of the things that appealed to me about UCL was the Grant Museum of Zoology. Yeah. There's also the famous quagga skeleton there, which is an extinct zebra with the missing leg, which was due to the Blitz.
Wow, is that right?
And of course, and many of Darwin's own specimens in the collection as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, yeah.
Named after Robert Grant, actually, who taught Darwin at Edinburgh.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, speaking of teaching, then, at the moment, can you give us a bit of the lay of the land when it comes to schools? How are things like evolution, the origins of life, the Big Bang, are these things taught in science classrooms as fact? And perhaps, are there any misconceptions that educators have about these theories? Right.
Yeah. Good question. So, well, just to give an overview, some listeners, some teachers listening will know this, of course, well, that the relevant sort of foundational concepts that are taught in primary will include the basics of the solar system, how rocks and fossils are formed, Then one I was familiar with, the topic I taught often was the living things and their environment, comes in year 4 according to national curriculum. So classifying living things and then how they adapt to changing environments. It's only in year 6 really that evolution comes in perhaps more explicitly, with change over time, fossils providing clues from millions of years ago. It's the first reference to long ages and living things producing offspring of the same kind, but variation and adaptation leading to evolution. And then, of course, Key Stage 3 and GCSE brings in the more technical detail about the mechanisms of inheritance, genetics, and evolution, and the Big Bang, of course, and its evidences as the most popular model. And surveys show actually that teachers do feel perhaps the least confident in some of these areas than in others. And that's interesting. But in terms of misconceptions, well, yeah, there are many. I suppose we can be specific. There are things like, well, evolution says humans are descended from monkeys. I mean, that's not what evolutionary theory says. Of course, it says that we share a common ancestor with them and all living things. Or that the Big Bang is an explosion. Again, it's not really the case. It's seen as an expansion of the universe. Maybe even the idea that evolution explains the origin of life. Of course, it doesn't do that. That's a completely different area of research. It doesn't speak into the beginning of life. It only speaks about change, once there is life. In fact, as one of my evolutionary tutors used to say at university, the one thing that Origin of Species, Darwin's Origin of Species, doesn't deal with is the origin of species in that sense. And perhaps also that things like, the Big Bang is the only explanation for the beginning of the universe. Actually, I'm not talking here about creationist interpretations, but within mainstream science, there are actually lots of other models. And there are mainstream scientists who reject the Big Bang model. Or in terms of evolution, the fact that, as you suggest, it's done and dusted. And I think that leads to the bigger, perhaps more significant misconception to mention, which the origins issue perhaps exposes more than others, is what is science and how is science done? Yes, of course, there are facts to be taught, whether it's the planets in the solar system or the bones in the skeleton. But science is not actually a body of knowledge, like a set of encyclopedias to digest. It is a method for understanding the world. It's a method that actually describes the world rather than ultimately explaining it. Newton described how things fall. He didn't actually explain why they fall. So ideas in science, like Big Bang, like the theory of evolution, these overarching frameworks, which is what theories are. It's another misconception, isn't it? That theory is like a guess or opposite to a fact. Actually, is the end of a process. It's a framework for doing science within it and understanding the world. These are malleable things. These are always changing. They're being tweaked in the light of new evidence, and sometimes they're completely overturned. So theories are not necessarily all wrong or all right. There are levels of uncertainty. And to be honest, the national curriculum does make reference to the nature of science models, but I'm not sure that's something that's emphasized enough in practice.
Sure. So that's really helpful, because I suppose, I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. I assumed that there was almost a binary view of, you either believe in the Big Bang as the explanation of the universe, and then evolution after that, or you believe in more of a intelligent design and what we would say would be a kind of a biblical understanding of creation, whatever that looks like down the road, and we can come on to that in a minute.
Yeah,
so what
sure.
you're saying is, actually, even in the kind of secular science world, there are different understandings of the origins of life. Not every scientist would subscribe to the Big Bang.
That's right. Yeah, there was a famous letter actually some years ago now, but there was a famous letter with, I don't know, about over 30 cosmologists who wrote a letter explaining why they didn't hold to the particular Big Bang model. Yeah, so that sort of thing is going on in science all the time.
Okay, that's really interesting. So at the Biblical Creation Trust, would you have one model of a biblical understanding of creation, or would you accept that there are Christians with different perspectives on how God created or what that looks like? Or would you say that no, the Bible is pretty clear And this is the kind of the time frame for how God created, and we must accept it as written, because I suppose it's one of those things that I don't really think about it too often, and maybe I should, but I just accept that God created all things, and that his knowledge is lofty and far superior to mine. And actually, it doesn't cause any kind of existential crisis in me. I just know that God created all things, and I don't really think about the implications. But is it important that we really think about these things?
Right. And so as Christians in general, yeah, right. So yeah, BCT, we are young age creationists, and so our starting point is the Bible. We believe in the infallibility of Scripture, the perspicuity of Scripture. We believe that how God tells us He created is how He did it, and we believe that that can be a starting point and a framework. So just as those in the mainstream begin with a framework, a commitment to long ages, millions of years, and to common ancestry, and then they investigate the evidence. So we believe that the Bible can also be a good starting point for science. And people will think that's restrictive to do objective science, but actually it's because it doesn't give us all the details, it leaves us very large parameters within which to do serious creation research and science. And so we think you can interpret, for example, the geologic ages, the rock layers, in terms of largely the result of the floods described in Genesis. You can interpret the living world and its patterns of distinct groups with gaps between groups, that in both the living world and the fossil record. You can interpret that in relation to what's described about God creating, separate kinds. On the matter of whether it's important, we do think it is important from in terms of the gospel, because and we always want to engage with those with other views. So the other views being, obviously, there's old earth creationism, which would accept the old ages and usually the Big Bang, although it would question aspects of evolution, and they would perhaps believe in special creation. And then, of course, there's the very common position, even in evangelicalism, which is theistic evolution, that God used the evolutionary process. What we would say is that why this? Oh yeah, and then there's intelligent design, as you mentioned. That the broader idea that complexity and design in the natural world points us to intelligence. The information in the DNA, for example, points to intelligence, which is a very reasonable scientific conclusion, even though it's lumped in with creationism in terms of schools and the government, as we'll come to, I'm sure. But just on the matter of why it matters is really about the issue of death. Any theistic evolutionary position has to accept that there was death before the fall as described in Genesis. And that doesn't just have implications for Genesis and how we read that. That has implications for what the New Testament says about an historical Adam, about the fall, the fact that we are fallen in Adam, but that there is redemption in Christ. It impacts on what Romans says, what 1 Corinthians 15 says. If death is something that God put in his original creation and declared it good, then that is, I think, a big problem for the gospel. And as one of my colleagues often says, we can talk about the length of the days, and that's an important debate to have. And I do believe they were literal 24-hour days. We can talk about the genre of Genesis. Again, it's another interesting, important issue, but they are not actually the most important questions in the origins issue. The most important question, we could say, is why did Jesus have to die physically and rise again physically? Because if physical death was not the result of the fall, but was there already before the fall, then why did Jesus have to do that? Why couldn't he just have died spiritually? Of course, there was a sense in which we died spiritually at the fall, but the Bible is clear that physical death came in as a result of the fall. And so we think that's where it has a big impact on the gospel. And, I've heard recently some quite big names and really good people who I respect a lot have discussions on this issue on podcasts and things. And they'll sometimes not even touch on that issue, on that death before the fall issue. And to me, that is a crucial reason why I do think we should hold to a young age creationist position. You can show that from the New Testament without even referring to Genesis in many ways.
That's really interesting. And I presume you have some resources on your website that would kind of explore more of the detail of the young earth creation idea, or as you
Yes. Yeah.
propose it. I mean, because that's something I admit rather, naively, lazily, I really haven't looked into, but it has made me think I probably do now.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, we have a website. We've also just started a new website for the creation, the Cambridge House Project, as we're calling it, as I mentioned. And a really good starting place is Steve and Lloyd, my colleagues' book, Adam or Death, which came first. It's just a short booklet, which puts the case for why this issue is important for the gospel and science and apologetics. And then leading on from that, my other colleague, Paul Garner, has written The New Creationism, which is a very much a positive book about the model building that's going on from a biblical starting point. So we're very much, creationism sometimes in the past, or in some cases, can be just about knocking evolution, but actually there's a much more positive aspect about building models, that glorify God, because they're starting with the Bible, but they're still serious science models. We would be doing this even if evolution wasn't a thing and didn't exist. We'd still be doing it because it's science within a biblical framework.
Sure.
So that's a good place. There's a couple of good resources to start. And my colleague Paul Garner also does a podcast with Dr. Todd Wood from the States, Let's Talk Creation, where they talk through all kinds of issues related to the origins topic, be they theological or scientific, and that people find that a very helpful resource as well.
Sure. Okay. Helpful. Thank you. So let's think back to the classroom, schools, and so you make a very compelling case for this as a Christian to really be thinking about the legitimacy and the coherence of a biblical worldview hanging on the creation story. And I think that's very important. How does that fit into what we teach in schools? What does the UK law or the guidance from the Department for Education actually say about teaching this in schools? Because you probably are aware that in the past there have been controversies in schools where perhaps they've had a Christian character and they've been accused of teaching creationism in the science classroom. What does the law say?
Okay, so in any state-funded school, yes, it is very clear that you are not allowed to teach creationism or even intelligent design as valid scientific theories, as alternatives to mainstream theories in a science lesson. Now, of course, you can't ignore addressing some of these questions and issues about origins in those science lessons. It comes up. In fact, just as I was thinking about, joining you today, someone I know was teaching a year 6 lesson on evolution last week, and the very first question from a child in that lesson, a pupil in that lesson, was, what about Adam and Eve? And so, you can't ignore it. But the guidance, of course, says that, well, then you should use that opportunity to contrast a scientific explanation with a faith-based, idea. And of course, you are allowed to talk about creationism more freely, or intelligent design, in RE lessons and philosophy lessons. In completely independently funded schools, the government still advises they should not present creationism and ID as equally valid, but actually, technically, I've seen some documents to this effect, there is legal protections there. So I think that completely independent private schools can do and shouldn't be marked down just for that alone by Ofsted. And I think it's important for me to point out, I've outlined something of our position as young age creationists, but as a creationist, I am very much for the teaching of evolution, because it is the current paradigm within which mainstream science is working. It needs to be taught. It needs to be taught well. Whatever we think of a model, it's to be presented. And secondly, I'm also not particularly a big advocate of, even if it were likely, of forcing schools to teach creationism, because most teachers, obviously, well, many would oppose it, but also even those sympathetic to it are not really familiar with the most robust forms of creationism that are out there, which is one of our roles at BCT, is to try to promote and educate people about those forms of serious creationist research. But I do think that there should be freedom, that the law isn't really the best here. I think there should be the freedom for teachers to explore different ideas in science lessons, because the freedom to question and critique is very much part of the scientific process. And it seems odd to outlaw or cancel a particular idea, because creationism does make scientific claims. And whether your model is right or wrong doesn't actually have a bearing on whether you're doing science. So when the government states, as they do, I mean, here's a letter actually that I saw from the DFE just a few months ago. This is through my involvement with a little group called the Academic Integrity in School Science, which does sort of lobby the government to just to encourage that these things should be allowed alongside other explanations. And they say creationism has no place in any science curriculum, should not be taught as a valid scientific alternative. It doesn't accord with the scientific consensus or the large body of established scientific evidence. Sorry, I've lost the bit. I've lost the P. What I was meaning to say, somewhere else they said, that creationisms do not. Oh yeah, sorry, this is it. They do not accurately and consistently employ the scientific method. Well, that statement is just not true, because there are creationist scientists who are operating. Some are operating in the mainstream world as scientists, but they're also doing all the things that mainstream scientists do. They are predicting, they are drawing up hypotheses, they're collecting and analyzing data, they are undergoing peer review. I mean, some will say, well, yes, they're doing science, they're creationists personally, but they're doing science in the mainstream. Yes, but they're also publishing aspects of creation models in mainstream journals. I've got a list here in front of me of examples of creationist research that does relate to a creation model that has been published in mainstream journals. So it's just incorrect what the government is actually saying about creationism there.
Okay, so that's really interesting and helpful. And actually, there is a case then that we can still maintain that sense of scientific integrity, whilst looking into alternate theories. Is there anywhere in the world where, you mentioned the States? What are schools? Do you know much about schools over there? Sorry, that's a question that I completely plucked out of the air. So I apologize if you're not prepared for that.
Well, the situation is very different there because of because of the whole church state thing, isn't there? It's a very different situation in that religious education is very different in that it doesn't really feature in schools. On the other hand, it's perhaps also very much more polarized there than it is here. Sometimes it's influences from that debate that have influenced things here. In fact, last year it was 100 years since the Scopes trial, the famous trial over the teaching of evolution in schools. But that was a lot more of a complex than is made out, in terms of the simple creation versus evolution controversy. But yeah, I think things are very different there.
Sure. Yeah. So what I'm interested in is, and you touched upon this before we stopped recording, so this is a topic that when it comes to science, or particularly this area of science, there are secularists and humanists who find this almost to be the number one issue when it comes to teaching in schools. And I've heard of cases, even in the last year, where the National Secular Society has referred schools to local councils and for investigation after uncovering evidence that, that teachers were attempting to convert or attempting to promote creationism in schools. Now, thankfully, the school I'm thinking of in particular was found to be operating fully within relevant legislation, completely exonerated, thankfully. But the National Secular Society doesn't seem to be as concerned about other or what they would deem to be unscientific ideas being promoted in schools. And I'm sure you can imagine what I'm talking about. Things like sex not being, with gender issues, the idea that, you can change your gender, and that being taught in essence as fact in many schools. Not so much, I would say, now, because there have been moves to clamp down on this. I'm just wondering, why is this such a big issue for secularists, do you think?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I suppose, the origins issue is controversial because it isn't purely scientific, because where we came from, does have philosophical, moral, and ethical dimensions.
Mm.
It's about who we are, isn't it? So
Yeah.
therefore, it's going to impact on how we should live and where we're going. And you mentioned the National Secular Society, yes, and the increase in evolution in the curriculum, which, although, as I've said, it's not actually that much, I don't think, in primary anyway, but it has increased in, about 10, 12 years ago. And the banning of creationism has been the result largely of these groups like the NSS and Humanists UK. And that does include scientists. And of course, bodies like the Royal Society have also spoken against creationism and so on. But these are scientists that are driven by their philosophical position. I would say religious belief, though they wouldn't put it like that. Because what I find interesting, in my experience, when you talk to a mainstream scientist and you sort of say what your position is as a creationist, many are actually, they're surprised, but many are actually pretty open to hearing a different perspective. But the best scientists should be always, because then there might be something that we can all be shown from someone with a different perspective when it comes to science. So I think that's interesting that it's these particular scientists who have made it their real passionate campaign against creationism has been because they're coming from an atheistic position. The ones who have lobbied the government loudest have been those kinds of groups. And the irony is that they're in danger of doing precisely what they accuse creationism of doing, because they're imposing a philosophical position on science. And what they oppose, obviously, as I've sort of hinted at already, is often a caricature of creationism, or it's the worst of creationism, because they simply won't engage with serious creationists, whereas, we want to engage with all the different perspectives, both, in terms of other Christian perspectives to as well as the secular world. So that's definitely where the pressure has been coming from. It's been these ideological groups, atheistical groups, it's not true to say it's just from the science community as a whole.
Yeah.
But there are other pressures on teachers, aren't there, in this area? Obviously, pressure will come from parents with particular views, whether they're anti-religious views or whether they're, particular religious views. And that's not just in Christian terms, that's Islam as well, of course. It plays into this. And as you mentioned about the recent case of a school, the media likes a confrontation story, don't they? So that's often blown out of proportion. And very often, as in that case, a school, this school was teaching creationism, but actually when it's looked at, it's not breaking the rules at all. It's keeping within the rules very much.
Yeah, no, I did look into that, and it really was blown out of all proportion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it really was quite a targeted attack, I think.
Yeah.
So let's ask a slightly harder question, though, because we can't deny that perhaps in the past there have been some mistakes that Christians have made when discussing science and faith in particular contexts. I mean, have there been, obviously we don't want to demonize anyone, but how can we avoid perhaps some of those mistakes that then feed into some of these attacks?
Do you mean, it's a couple of ways of thinking about that. Do you mean in terms of there's been, like, as I often say, there's been some like poor creationism out there?
Yeah, I suppose that's what I would say.
In terms of, very sort of confrontational, and sort of sarcastic attacks. And one of the things we do, we're not the only ones who do it, of course, by any means, but we really much try to emphasize at BCT a very reasonable approach, reasoning things through, being honest about the challenges we face, being very gracious in our engagement at all levels with the debates that are going on within creationism as well as within the church over these issues. And and I've encountered many times very respectful, as I mentioned, respect from the opposition. Even some of my lecturers at university, I can remember, were very respectful of a creationist position, though they may have been atheists and evolutionists, and that's interesting. So there's that. I also think that, and of course, it's always important to be respectful of views as teachers, isn't it, and sensitive to the views of, and that goes in all directions. I mean, surveys also show, don't they, the damaging psychological effects on pupils whose deeply held views have perhaps been dismissed flippantly that might be in the context of a science lesson.
So,
But in terms of, yeah, on the other hand, people in general, one of the biggest, I suppose, errors in this area is that people in general assume science is the opposite of faith, don't
yeah.
they? But that's not actually the case. I mean, yes, it's by faith as Christians, we understand that the world was framed by the word of God, but the Christian gospel is also about putting our faith in what the evidence shows us in many ways. And modern science, of course, grew out of a Christian worldview. The founding fathers of modern science were largely creationists who were motivated by glorifying the creator. And it was because of that that they even, that they had the assumption that there would be laws that they could investigate in the world. I mean, why should such laws even exist in a random, purposeless universe? In fact, there's a fantastic short book about this, just came out last year by the theologian Hans Maduemi, which I thoroughly recommend. I think you can get it from Crossway, I think. It's called Does Science Make God Irrelevant? And brilliant for showing succinctly why science grew out of a Christian worldview. But many Christians even make this mistake of seeing science and the Bible as opposites.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a popular view, particularly in the theistic evolutionary sort of world. The Bible is about, science is about how, and the Bible is about why. And I always find that quite interesting because the book of Genesis actually doesn't tell you why God created the world. It tells you how he did it. It doesn't, not in all the detail, but it tells you how, but it doesn't tell you why. And the most common science questions we ask, particularly in the classroom, are why questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
Why does this ice melt near the heat? And why does this paperclip move by the magnet and so on? So it's true that God has spoken to us. We believe as Christians that God has spoken through his word and through his world. Psalm 19 tells us that. But these two are not separate. These are intertwined. Theology and science are fields of knowledge that interact and overlap. And at the end of the day, the Bible is also part of the evidence that God has given us in his world, which is why it's also, as well as his inspired word, it's also a good starting point and framework within which to investigate the world scientifically. It's part of that evidence. So I think it's interesting to think like that.
So with that in mind then, but also thinking about the parameters that teachers have to operate in legally, how can Christian teachers encourage that critical thinking, that respectful discussion about these big questions? Because as you say, they often arise quite organically. And will occur just by virtue of talking about the topic you've got for that lesson. And is it something you should just shrug off and say, well, you can ask your RE teacher about that? Or is it something you feel you can tackle in a science classroom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think we need, even if our perspective, even if we're creationists, but even as Christian teachers, we don't need to break the rules. I think there's lots you can do in a science lesson without breaking the rules. And there's the opportunity to explore more in RE. I mean, at the end of the day, even when I go into schools with a different hat on as well, not as BCT, but as, doing Christian assemblies. And we always frame things in a school context differently to a church context, don't we? We're always saying, because it's reasonable to do so, as Christians like me believe, and then you can explain the gospel. So that applies here as well. I mean, I've never used my platform either as a teacher or as a visitor into schools to push, you must believe young age creationism, but neither I'd only even discuss that if I'm asked to do that, which has happened. Doesn't happen very often, but has happened on a couple of occasions in a state school. I've had a couple of opportunities in year 6 classes to discuss, and even in that context, I would present it alongside the other views. We can do all that, but we would be the same as when we have gospel opportunities as visitors into schools, in assemblies, and so on. But I would say that, so there is lots we can do. Evolution needs to be presented well, as we've said, but not as a dogma, but as an idea, as I've been saying, that does explain a lot of the data, and is accepted by the majority. But in other areas, it doesn't fit the data well. And so pupils should be encouraged to ask challenging questions about it. In fact, that's what we do in all areas of science. And it's also, as we said, it's part of science, questioning, critiquing. but it's also required by the national curriculum. So this is sort of an irony, isn't it? That the curriculum actually does require that critiquing and questioning, which we should be doing anyway. And, so for example, I mean, evolution is a powerful idea, powerful theory. It explains transitional fossils, it explains genetic similarity, explains what we observe about adaptation and changes. It explains the distribution of species, biogeography, and comparative anatomy. But it also has huge challenges. The Cambrian explosion in the fossil record, how all major body plans appear rapidly in that record quickly. And so we can encourage questions about that. Complex structures, irreducibly complex structures like the eye or the nervous system, the gaps in the fossil record, even when the fossil records lineages of many creatures actually seem to be fairly complete because we've got the record back to the Cambrian explosion, and yet there are still these huge gaps. The different mechanisms involved, there are all kinds of challenging questions that you can encourage pupils to ask, and simply by, when there is the opportunity, presenting different explanatory options and not excluding any. In that, you're encouraging this questioning. And there's a right consensus about a skepticism about consensus. If no one had questioned the consensus in the past, science would have made very little progress. I mean, the classic example of that is geocentrism, isn't it? That the Earth went round the sun. That the sun went around the Earth. And everybody believed that in the scientific community as it was, and then it was challenged and of course eventually overturned. And it's another story that's presented as this simple battle of science versus faith, but actually it was much more about debates going on within the church and within science at the time. And we're often compared as creationists to the church at the time, and Galileo is like the evolutionists. I think they're like Galileo. Actually, think about it, it's the other way around, because we're the dissenting voice against the consensus, and so the sort of establishment is actually behaving more like the medieval church when they shut down debate and don't allow a critique. And so I think, and making those connections across science and RE really important. And again, something that the national curriculum encourages, doesn't it? Those cross-curricular links, because subjects are not sealed boxes, and it can be fruitful to allow these different disciplines to interact. And another thing I was going to say was that many critiques of creationism will say, well, it isn't science, it's pseudoscience. And yet then they proceed to critique it scientifically in the same way. And by definition, it must then be science, because you can't critique something that isn't scientific. And this was what, I don't remember the case of Michael Rees back nearly 20 years ago now. And he was director of education at the Royal Society. And he was a theistic evolutionist, and so a Christian, but he believed, promoted evolution fully. But he raised this question. He said, creationists are bringing scientific arguments, so we should respectfully deal with them. He said, I think science can deal with them, but he said they are bringing, and even for that alone, he was shot down and sort of had to, forced out of the Royal Society just for suggesting that. And but I think that there's all these things we can do, encouraging questioning, presenting different models when you can. I mean, never mind creationism in science lessons, bring more evolution into RE lessons because of its ethical implications. That would be interesting too, wouldn't it?
That's a great point, actually, because, and I think it just shows, doesn't it, that Christianity, whatever your kind of, as a Christian, whatever your kind of perspective on origins and creation, Christianity can stand up to rigorous evaluation. And
absolutely, yeah.
And I find that actually when it comes to schools curriculum, whatever the subject, Christians are often those that are advocating for more transparent discussion about a whole range of things. And we see it probably most often in humanities or in PSHE, that kind of thing, where often there are certain ideas that are presented very opaquely. This is fact, or there is some kind of implication that you must accept this explanation without any inquisition. And I often find that Christians are very careful and thoughtful, not because they are more intelligent, but because they've realized actually we need to be thinking about the implications of this idea or this theory, and we believe that because it has coherence, it can stand up for itself. So therefore, I'm not afraid to talk about the Christian view of this, that, or the other, if it's appropriate in a lesson. So, for example, in PSHE, often, even though the law requires it, very often teachers will not talk about the benefits of marriage, and will just talk about, safety and contraception and things like that. And actually, there is great benefit from talking about all kinds of different ideas about and theories in PSHE or history, geography, etc., and evaluating them on their own terms rather than having some kind of theory that must be taught as rote. Now, I've got one more question for you, and this is much more specific because this is something my daughter brought up at dinner time last night. Now, bearing in mind she's 8, she was saying, "Oh yeah, in school I've been learning about apes, Mummy." And she said to me, "Did you know that we are related to apes, that we are their relatives?" And I didn't really know how to respond to this because obviously, as you said, we share DNA with all kinds of creatures. But I wasn't entirely sure what she was meaning by that. Was she taught that we evolved from apes? Now, how would you, as a parent or as a teacher, how would you explore that with her? She's 8 years old, just for your reference.
Well, obviously, there's a sense in which we are animals because we are made of the same stuff, and that's how the world is designed. It wouldn't work, would it, if the things we eat even have to be made of the same stuff in order to be our food? And so then there are animals that are nearer to us in terms of their morphology, in terms of how they're made up, what they look like, and their behavior. So chimps and gorillas, for example, are the things that are nearest to us. However, there's still a huge gap there. There are still huge differences, and that small amount, I mean, they talk about 98% of DNA being the same. Actually, that depends how you measure it. It can be as low as 85. But even so, the point is, of course we share that DNA. But actually, that 2% difference is huge. It's a huge amount of differences in terms of the genome. And what's really interesting, so there is this distinction and difference between us and the thing that's nearest to us. But what's really interesting is when you then look at all the finds, the hominin fossils, the things that have been found like Neanderthal man and Homo habilis and Homo erectus, the southern apes, Australopithecus, Lucy, the famous skeleton. These are presented in a very convincing way that's sort of bridged that gap. And that's another misconception, not in that sort of linear way, the famous diagram, but in more of a tree, a bush of relationship. And it all looks very convincing. Surely these things do seem to share features of humans and apes. But actually, there's a lot of work going on in the creationist community, real robust science that's demonstrating over and again that when you really analyze these fossil remains, they are still falling into two discrete groups. They are still, and Todd Wood, Paul's co-host on the Let's Talk Creation podcast, has actually done this work himself. This is an exciting new field of, it's actually called baraminology. It just means the study of the created kind and how things fall into separate groups. And this is an area, we mentioned it in the curriculum, it's an area children really like to classify things, don't they? Children like to think about how you group things. They do that naturally. Well, it's part of being human, wanting to classify, wanting to put things into groups. I mean, the first thing that God told Adam to do was to name the creatures, wasn't he? To be a zoologist, to classify them. He was the first zoologist, I like to say. But so that's what they're finding. Creationists doing this research and really scrutinizing these fossil remains, perhaps even in a way, in a way not being done in the mainstream world, because the mainstream world is only looking for similarity and continuity all the time. But the creationists, we think, well, let's look for discontinuity. Let's look for the gaps between things. And we are finding that there is still this clear distinction between those things that are human. So things like Neanderthal and Homo habilis, Homo erectus, these are just part of the human family. These are just distinct variations of those who are descended from Adam via Noah. And the things that are non-human, some of which are extinct apes, like the southern apes, like the Australopithecines. So there is, and we can have every confidence that there, in spite of all these finds, there is still this clear distinction, this clear barrier between humanity and non-humanity. And that, of course, goes with what we would expect, what we would predict from our understanding that God made separate groups of things, especially we know for sure that humanity was a separate creation. We're made in the image of God and created differently. And that's so important for ethical and moral implications as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my husband and I could answer it from that sort of theological perspective in terms of, we have a soul, we are made in the image of God. And so, yes, there may be some DNA similarities, but we are entirely different in terms of who we are made to reflect and the purpose we are made for as well.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
But it is helpful to have some of that kind of
there's a talk actually. It's not that it's aimed so much at that age group, but there is a talk on our YouTube channel by Paul Garner actually on Adam, apes and ancestors, I think it's called, on that subject, which is very useful.
Great. Well, that's probably a good place to end. Is there anything else that you want to kind of, recommend that teachers, science teachers in particular, look at or consider?
Just, I suppose one thing, I may have mentioned it, but just to emphasize again, another way of approaching this is again to think about that whole worldview issue, that, the evidence is always interpreted within a worldview. So, how you look at a fossil, for example, the fossil is neutral, the evidence is neutral, but how you interpret it will depend on whether we're coming from a biblical perspective and looking at a large amount of the fossil record being the result of the flood, and whereas an evolutionist is coming from the commitment in the millions of years of the common ancestry. So the evidence is neutral, and it's important in teaching to realize that distinction between the low level, the specific things that are being studied, and the overarching worldview that will determine how we look at the evidence. And there's many more things we could talk about in terms of the challenges to the mainstream view. But it's just understanding that it is the same process. It is doing science, but coming from a different perspective to be involved in this creationist stuff. And science is good. We love science, but it's limited as well. And it's important to remember that. And we've mentioned how it came from a Christian worldview. And it isn't so much about proving things, but building an understanding of the world. And what I'm saying is you can do that from a biblical starting point just as much as from a mainstream one. And then I suppose I'd also just like to emphasize that what we just touched on, that Origins does speak into this image and identity thing. I know you've covered recently at ACT, haven't you, the topic of image of God?
Yeah.
And this is so important. I always think this is one of the most valuable aspects of the Origins ministry that I'm engaged with, that the mainstream education system and so on is sort of saying it's promoting well-being, isn't it? And yet at the same time, it is telling pupils that they have no ultimate purpose. There's no purpose, no meaning in life. There's no intrinsic worth or value. And personally, I think also the theistic evolutionary position has problems with this in terms of relative morality, because if we came from a population that God breathed into a advanced hominin, what about our ancestors? What about the past? Was it sin when they were killing each other and so on? This has problems too. But we certainly encourage young people, and it will depend, how we do it will depend on the exact context, to consider that they're made in God's image, that they are intrinsically valuable irrespective of their abilities or achievements, that they have a great purpose. And I think this is so important in the light of the identity crisis, mental health crisis today, isn't it? And ultimately we believe as Christians that purpose is to know their creator through the Lord Jesus Christ, the creator himself, the one through whom all things were made. So I think it's important to think about that as well.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Where can we find out more about Biblical Creation Trust?
So we have our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org. And as I say, we've also just set up a Cambridge House Project website, and student meetings have begun in Cambridge, bringing students together to discuss many of these issues around the theology and science of origins. And then, as I said, Let's Talk Creation is on YouTube and other platforms, which is a fortnightly podcast with my colleague Paul Garner and Dr. Todd Wood from Core Academy in the States. And that's really useful. You can look up the topics that you're most interested in, about 130 episodes now.
Wow.
And I should mention as well, in terms of young people in schools, we do have a little booklet called I'm a Creationist, Get Me Out of Here, which is really aimed at pupils or students, young people and students, how to deal with, as a creationist, how to deal with evolutionary things when you're being taught. It's not a book of arguments. It's a book of just a short booklet of principles about respectfully asking questions when appropriate, but respectfully, and doing the best to learn what you're there to learn as well. That sort of approach. And also Paul Garner's textbook, really, Fossils and the Flood, which is a beautifully illustrated book which draws from the very best of creation research, but presents it in a very easily accessible manner, which really is for all ages. But young children even can access that because of its illustrations. Fossils and the Flood is available from 10 of those, published by New Creation. And that reminds me, the New Creation blog is also an excellent place to find out about what's going on in creation research. There's a whole generation of young creation researchers and students there who are writing sort of for the layperson about the latest papers in creation science. So New Creation blog, I think it is, it's a really good place to look as well for these things.
Wow, an absolute wealth. And I'm glad it's for the layperson, because I'm definitely a layperson. But no, that's fantastic. And just have to say, bless you, well done for all you're doing, and really appreciate your time today for expanding on this topic that is so controversial, but is now, I realise, so necessary for us to grasp as Christians, and particularly as Christian teachers. So thank you.
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Yes, thank you.